Hi sewing friends, welcome to my sewing room. I finished a baby quilt just a couple days ago and right away I need to get it quilted. So I sprayed the batting with some 505 spray and I smoothed the quilt down, and now I am working on the backing, just spraying that batting, and then I smoothed the fabric down, and before you know it, my quilt sandwich will be ready to go. I will be quilting diagonal lines through my quilt, so I found the 45-degree line on my ruler, and I'm going to line this up with the edge of my quilt and use my long ruler to put the lines through the quilt. Now, you wouldn't really need to do them exactly at 45 degrees, but that's how I'm doing it here today. And I'm taking some painter's tape and just setting it along that ruler and just moving my ruler down all the way through the middle of the quilt as I go along and adding pieces of tape. I rolled up the right side of the quilt as I work here, and I'm going to use a larger stitch on my machine, and this machine works just fine with the all-purpose foot. I know some machines would function better if you used a walking foot, but a lot of times my all-purpose foot works just fine going through this quilt and adding these quilting lines. After getting that first important quilt line through the center of my quilt, I took my ruler again, and I'm going to measure 3 inches away from that quilting line. I'm just putting the 3-inch mark on my ruler right on that sewing line and putting some tape to the right of that first line, and then I'll be sewing along these pieces of tape. So I reuse the painter's tape, and I use it as long as I can, as long as it stays sticky enough to adhere to the quilt. After getting all of my quilting lines in, I worked to the right, and then I turned the quilt over and I worked to the left. I cut the edge off the quilt using the quilt top as my guide. I just cut the excess backing and batting off of the edges. I found this beautiful green, orange, and yellow print for my binding, and I'm cutting 2.5-inch strips, and I need 5 strips to go around. First thing I needed to do was to give myself a straight edge, so I'm going to cut 5 strips 2.5 inches wide. I joined all of my binding strips, laying them like this, the ends together, and then I put a seam in there, sort of a diagonal seam from corner to corner, and I tried to let the selvages hang off the edge there because I'd rather not have those selvages in my binding. And after making sure it's straight, I just cut off those triangles there and tried to cut a little bit of that selvage that's hanging off there, and then I will press this long strip of binding in half and then attach it to my quilt. Today I'm attaching the binding to the back of the quilt, and then I will roll it to the front and top stitch around. That's often what I do for baby and toddler quilts because I think it might last a little bit longer with all of the use and the washing that I expect will happen with this quilt. As you can see, I left a little tail before starting to attach the binding. And when I get down to that first corner, I'll stop before getting to the corner, and I'll leave my needle in the quilt there, and then I will turn the quilt just a little bit, and then I'm going to sew off of the corner. And I have a little tiny sort of angled seam there, and then I turn the quilt and I lift that binding up, and then I fold it down so the fold is right on the edge of the quilt, and I'll start sewing right there at the top of that fold, and I'll do the same thing all the way around. After getting all the way around my quilt, I stopped about 10 to 12 inches before I got to the end, and I now have 2 tails, and I cut off that piece on the right, and on the left here I want to measure that tail. I want that tail to be 2.5 inches, so I'm using that little piece of binding that I cut off to measure, and now I have these 2 little leftover pieces. So my binding should be exactly 2.5 inches longer all the way around, and I will put these 2 tails together just like I did when I was joining that long piece of binding. I'll put them together like this, and also from corner to corner. And you kind of have to bunch up the quilt to give yourself room to work here. And after I add that seam, I always make sure that it fits before cutting away those excess triangles from that little piece of binding. So I cut away those little triangles after making sure it fits, and now I'm going to lay that binding down, and I will pin, and then I'll finish that stitch from where I ended to where I began, and all that binding should be now attached, and I can roll it around to the front, and then I will top stitch all the way around the quilt. And here's our beautiful baby quilt, just in time for the baby shower. I really like the way this quilt turned out. With just a few little cute pictures, I was able to work around all those little pictures with some scraps, and it turned out so cute. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.